Well, keep in mind that in the United States, very few people paid any attention to the VE Day, victory in Europe in, uh, you know, 1945. There just wasn't much attention paid to it. That doesn't mean people didn't pause to remember the war itself, but it doesn't play the same role. And I'll be frank with you, the surrender of the Japanese in August of 1945 was probably far more significant in most American minds. And that has to do with the fact that we were directly attacked by the Japanese. And that let's not debate, how that came about, but nevertheless it happened. And that's something that had a permanent impact on Americans. So that particular celebration, I think, will hold far more significance for many. Got to remember that in the United States, no one was really interested in going to war against Germany in World War I, and we were sort of dragged into that illegitimately, and we regretted it. And afterwards, there was a tremendous movement to stay out of any future European war. It turned out that the bombing of Pearl Harbor was the critical hook that FDR had been looking for to get us into the war against Germany. So, Eisenhower used to express his frustration all the time when he would see American soldiers, and he would, do you hate Germans yet? And of course, the kid stood there and said, no, sir. If you look at most of the people who were in the army, I would say at least a third to half of them were of German ancestry. So, that is kind of ridiculous. But, finally, the hatred was stirred up by the discovery of concentration camps. But even that, I don't think lasted very long in terms of hatred towards Germans. So, I think for the Soviet Union, that was their great moment, even though their losses were horrific and, in my judgment, far beyond what was necessary. But Stalin didn't care how many millions of people he sacrificed. And the bad news is that the victory is not understood in a proper context in Russia. They don't understand there was never any real fundamental de-Stalinization, contrary to popular belief. And there are still people over there that think Stalin was this strong man that got things right. I mean, it's incomprehensible, but you know that from your time in Russia. So I think the Russians now use this as an opportunity to show unity with those people that they think agree with them. And obviously, China is a big part of that, and the Chinese suffered terribly under the Japanese. And no one disputes that. That was, beyond anybody's wildest imagination. So it makes sense that the Chinese would be there. Everyone else, to be polite, shows up because they want to do business with Russia. There's certainly no reason why we should not show up to do business with Russia, in my judgment. That doesn't mean that you are celebrating communism. I certainly don't and never did. But it's a national event for them. It's important for them, and we should show them respect and understanding. But we won't. I mean, that's obvious.
Well, there were some media reports, but they were well contested, or if not, well, argued to be false, that Trump at some point was considering going to Moscow. Again, I'm not sure if that was real or not. But now, of course, it's shifted a bit after. At least I was quite optimistic that he was going to walk away from this war. But now, of course, with this after the mineral deal, it appears that he's starting to ship more weapons and getting further drawn into the war. I mean, I guess I have a two dual question there though. This mineral deal, how significant is it? And as a result of this, do you see this as becoming Trump's war now, or we're not quite there yet?
Well, I think it's Trump's war simply because he was foolish enough to be drawn into it. Uh, if you listen to Trump during the election and in the immediate aftermath of the election, he was saying all the right kinds of things. But very shortly thereafter, he was besieged by people who convinced him that I think of several things. First of all, you can't do anything, President Trump, unless it looks like a win for you. In other words, if you're going to go sign an agreement, it has to be a win for you. Everything has to be a win. Everything is seen as a contest in the private sector sense. This is a real estate salesman. So he sees everything as I've got to win. I can't lose. Uh, I had urged him to just end all aid to this heinous regime in Kiev and withdraw all U.S. military personnel and civilians from Ukraine. Period. Get out. End it. Tell the Europeans we're out. We'll be happy to host a peace conference where you and the Russians can sit down and work out future borders, but we're not going to stay. He's now done a 180-degree turn, and he's going in the opposite direction. I think it's a serious mistake because I don't think Zelensky will last. And as soon as Zelensky is out of business, that'll be the end of this agreement.
Well, I was also noticed that with the 9th of May celebration, there's another ceasefire now. We just had a ceasefire in which the Russians announced unilaterally ceasefire over Easter. And of course, now we have on 9th of May. So some would see this as being well, very holy or holy or sacred day for Russia. That is, being now a very Christian country, but also, of course,
Yeah,
the importance of 9th of May in their historical memory. Or do you see this as being a test run for proving that there is a possibility to end this war? That not a taste, but testing out the waters, whether or not the opponents, that is the Europeans, Ukrainians, and Americans, are actually interested in pursuing further peace.
I think President Putin has made it very clear that this war is going to end on the terms that Russian military power impose. That's his view. He said it will be dictated by the logic of the battlefield for all intents and purposes, and I think he's right. We certainly can't bring anything to this any longer. Uh, Before Trump, we were a co-belligerent, actively doing everything in our power to harm Russia. The hope was that President Trump would end that and normalize relations with Russia. And indeed, there were meetings that indicated that might happen. That's been lost now. And as a result, President Putin spoke to the business community in Russia a few weeks ago and said, forget the sanctions, forget the problems with the West. This is not going to change. So we are going to look elsewhere. And that brings in, the SCC and the BRICS and so forth. In other words, there are other people we're going to do business with because the West is just not a reliable partner. Now, that doesn't mean that that will never change. I think he's a smart man and he knows that Europe is in great turmoil. How much longer can these confused Germans wander around in darkness in Berlin? I mean, the government there with this man Merz, who could not become chancellor, and I think that's a blessing, they are engaged in national suicide. That will end. And the only people that are opposed to national suicide in Germany are the AfD. And I think that's the right position, by the way, for them to take. But the left has done everything in its power. The Soros dominated elites running the show in Western Europe. They're all trying desperately to portray the AfD as a national German party, as a throwback to National Socialism. I don't think that'll work much longer. With every passing day, AfD becomes more powerful because the average German sees that his country is being destroyed. Eventually, it will be stopped. I think you will eventually see tremendous change in France. I think it will come to England, and then it will spread elsewhere. We've already seen, changes come about in many countries. You've got Fico in Slovakia, you've got Orban in Hungary. These people were always very sober-minded very early on. I think that's going to spread. I think you're going to see change in the right direction in Poland. People there are looking at the West and, as I call the globalist elites, funded, educated, socialized, and created by Soros as the real threat to civilization on the European continent. So, but unfortunately, I don't see us playing a major role. I think we've marginalized ourselves.
It is interesting to see, as now we're remembering the defeat of fascism, how it's actually remembered in the historical narratives, because the German government now, they they labeled AfD an extremist organization, which enables or allows its intelligence agencies to effectively, well, to some extent, go after AfD, which is now the largest political opposition. Now, the argument there is that AfD is far right, which means that they can be seen as fascists. So then you can just cancel the opposition if necessary. And of course, AfD looks at the German government now and argues, no, this is fascism. This way of trying to eliminate the opposition. So it is interesting how they see it through their own prism, but no, this canceling of the opposition, this is quite extreme, especially if you see it in the context of what's happening in France and other places. But
Well, again, yes, you're a professor and you teach these things at the university. The word fascism is derived from Latin, and it's has its roots in Rome. The bundle of sticks that bound together represented unity and strength to the Roman Senate and people, with the axe in the center. Uh, we have that symbol in the United States Senate. You know, this ancient Roman symbol, which was a fascist symbol. Fascism is about unity. That's it. And you have to ask yourself, who are the people that are afraid of national unity in Germany, in France, in Britain, in all these countries? Well, these are so-called globalists. Well, what is their inspiration? And it's very, very hard to say anything other than Marxism and communism, because communism sought to destroy national identity, destroy borders, and sort of transform people into an amorphous mass of workers and consumers. That's about it. And I think the Germans, certainly since they lost the war, have allowed themselves to be transformed into this quiet, uh, almost politically neutral public that marched in whatever direction the Allies and government said, because they were apologizing for whatever they did during the Second World War. I think the apology tour is over, and it should be over. And I think eventually Germany will straighten out. It may not happen immediately, but it will. So what you're describing in Germany, which is reminiscent of East Germany, the Stasi, uh, snooping and surveilling people and then threatening them, I think that will fail. And I think the alternative will be a nationalist movement that will take over and say, it's Germany first now. We have to think about ourselves, our national industry, our scientific industrial development, our economy. All of that will happen. It's a matter of waiting for it. And I think, if anything, Mr. Putin is very patient and he understands the true direction that things are moving. One benefit of having been a communist at some point in your life is that you learned about this thing we call the correlation of forces. Well, the correlation of forces is very much in favor of Russia. And the correlation of forces right now favors China. It favors many countries. It does not favor us. And it does not favor Europe in its current state of mind.
yeah, this is the frustrating part here, though, because more and more people recognize that the war is lost. Yet there's no one who dares to speak of peace. This is they're openly talking about now the prospect of war with Russia. Yet to prevent this, no one's reaching for the phone. It's quite remarkable, and I think this is part of the problem, or one of the benefits of having had a recent war would be that the people would have a healthy fear of war. Now that that generation has passed away, it doesn't seem our political class fears it much at all. Indeed, the whole idea of fighting the world's largest nuclear power, they seem to take it with a somewhat a bit disturbing ease. Um, but on that topic, though, now that we see that the Russians are not very hopeful anymore that Trump is actually going to end this war, they seem to be stepping up the the fighting on the front line. What do you see happening at the moment?
Well, I've always said that at some point the general staff would tell President Putin that it would be useful to be on the Dnieper River line. that you might as well just occupy and take all the territory up to that river line. It's a natural barrier. Uh, for hundreds and hundreds of years, it was the western frontier of Europe. Kiev, under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was a fortress of the West. Once you passed Kiev, once you passed that river, you were dealing with Tatars, Mongols, and Russians. You know, that's it. So I think if I were on the Russian general staff, that's what I would argue for. This is a defensible river line that gives us a buffer zone, if you will, and we are in a position to do whatever we need to against the western portion of Ukraine if it comes down to it. If anything's being demonstrated in this war, is that the strike capability, precision strike capability, whether it's a drone or cruise missile or ballistic missile, theater ballistic or strategic, there's nothing they cannot hit and destroy. And if you occupy that river line and you are compelled at some point to cross it, well, you're already there. In other words, you're not moving from a few hundred miles back. You're right up on the river. And so if you have to stage in order to cross to extinguish whatever heinous regime comes to power in Kiev, although I don't think Zelensky will last much longer. And if he does, he's not going to be replaced by something worse. I think there'll be a more amenable group at some stage. But then you have that benefit. Now, the one thing that he can still do that he hasn't done is he can cross the river and attack from the north down into Odessa. Odessa historically was Russian, never Ukrainian. And if he did that, that would strangle Ukraine. It would have no outlet, would have difficulty shipping grain and other products from Western Ukraine to other countries. Now, it doesn't mean that the Russians could cut them off completely, but it would certainly put them in a position to do so. And it may be that the Russians decide to do that as a matter of self-defense. I don't know. I just think that the best thing that we can do is to get out, but no, I don't have any support for that here in Washington. Everyone in Washington, with very few exceptions, wants to fight until every Ukrainian is dead and everything is destroyed. And that Western Ukraine could be made to look like vast areas of Eastern Ukraine. I think that's catastrophic, but there's not much informed thinking about these matters in Washington. There's a lot of narcissism in the sense that our national policy is mortgaged to vanity. That we can't sign on for anything that we don't quote unquote impose. President Trump can't do anything that doesn't reflect on him as a great man and a victor and a winner. So the idea that he could simply say, this was a mistake and I'm leaving is anathema to them. And the sad part of, as you know, is that when it came to the end of Vietnam, that's what we did. We just left. What happened in Iraq in 2011 is the last U.S. military column came out of Iraq in the dead of night. And they came out unannounced because whenever they told someone in Iraq we're leaving, as soon as they started to leave, they came under fire. They didn't come out during the daylight because they would have come under fire. So we essentially left Iraq at that point, I would argue, having been defeated. And then the same thing was true in Afghanistan, only the departure was an exercise in incompetence and imbecility. Every mistake you could make, everything that violates any common sense on the military side was ignored. So how many times do you have to fail? You look at Libya. What did we do in Libya? Well, Libya is split into two. You have essentially Eastern Libya that is allied with Egypt and Western Libya that is apparently Turkish and influenced by us, and we're keeping that pot boiling, which is a disaster. I would just say that, what we should do is something that President Trump used to talk about, but now apparently doesn't want to do, and that is to divorce ourselves from all of these military commitments overseas. Get out of this, because wherever we've been for any length of time, it's been a disaster. It doesn't work.
Yeah, the thing is, if he would have just cut his losses immediately, then it wouldn't have been blamed on him. But now that he's kept this war going, I think he's got yeah, reasons to fear that once this whole thing collapses on itself as another Afghanistan, that he will be held accountable. But this is what seems to be in the works because there's an article recently, I can't remember Forbes or Washington Post, in which it argued that yeah, the Russians are pumping out a lot of heavy military equipment, tanks and everything else, but very little of it is being sent to the front, as instead they're building up a huge, powerful force in the rear. Well, what do you see happening? What do you think the Russians are going for? Are they planning a major offensive? If so, what is Trump going to do if he loses the war, which is now effectively Trump's war?
Well, you're asking me what Trump's going to do, and I don't think Trump has got much that he can do. I mean, what, announce more sanctions? That's ridiculous. We've already sanctioned 34, 35 countries. We have a trade war underway with at least 90 countries. There's nothing he can do, certainly not militarily. I think the Russians have always been wary of what might happen with NATO, especially if we gave a green light that troops could move into Ukraine or something. And so they have always held back a very strong reserve to deal with that potential. I think that's what they're doing now. And remember, this man Putin knows the history of the region. He doesn't want control of Western Ukraine. He knows that, especially the further west you go in Ukraine, the more distinctly non-Russian the people are, and their culture and their language and so forth. He doesn't want anything to do with that. You've heard, you're familiar with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and one of the things that he urged in Russia was divest yourself of all these foreign peoples that you're ruling. You know, the Tsarist empire is over. Forget it. It was, you know, it's dysfunctional. In other words, we should try to focus on Russians, ruling Russians and nobody else. They've largely managed that. I think it's certainly an 80% solution. And I'm sure he feels the same way about Ukraine because even though Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, well, the Ukrainians are Slavic Orthodox Christians like ourselves, he knows enough about Ukraine to know that the West is not that way. What used to be called Galicia and Ruthenia in the old Austrian Empire, those people are very definitely not Russian and will never be Russian. And he doesn't want to force that. So I think he understands the dynamics very, very well. He also is a patient man. I think he'll continue to exercise patience. Patience has paid off for him. He's sustained very few casualties compared with his predecessors. I've never seen, looking back on Russian history, any single Russian leader that was as concerned about Russian loss of life in a war as he is. And that's not a weakness. You know, you listen to all of the generals, retired generals that have been telling us for years, Ukraine is winning and the Russians are losing. Uh, they say, well, that's because Russia's weak. Russia's not crossing the Dnieper because it can't. Well, that's not true. And I think that we're going to watch a number of things happen over the next month or two. And I would not be surprised if the whole picture changes quite suddenly. I don't think that Zelensky is going to survive this. And contrary to what a lot of people think, the public opinion on the whole in Ukraine wants an end to the war. The people suffering most have said, we've had enough, but they're not allowed to have an impact. And that, of course, is because the Ukrainian secret police will show up and you too can end up with a bullet in your head. Maybe you end up being shipped off to the front to die there. So this will eventually end, but it's not going to be anything that we do to end it.
Well, how do you see Zelensky's rule coming to an end? Do you think the Russians will take him out, or will the Americans want him away? The nationalists, the military,
In different
or
times, I think the West would have said enough's enough. I think more sober-minded people back in the 60s or 50s or 70s would have intervened quickly. Soon after the intervention began in February of 2022 and said, you know, we need an end to this. The longer you wait, the more territory you lose, the worse it will get. Sign the paper and shut up. I think that would have happened. But we aren't led by those kinds of people today. Those people were eminently pragmatic. Look at Eisenhower and his support for Austrian neutrality. As president, he said, that's wonderful. The Russians want to withdraw, fine. He said, by the way, why don't we make more countries neutral? Because we Americans don't have the military power to defend everybody. And at that point, NATO was half the size or less than it is now.
Well, that could be one of the outcomes from this war, though, because again, it's always framed as a Ukraine-Russia war, but it is a NATO-Russia proxy war, which people from Marco Rubio to yeah, Boris Johnson is now recognizing. But as NATO is defeated in Ukraine, what do you think the wider ramifications would be? Would be the changing role of NATO? Would the United States incentivize America to uh, reduce its presence in Europe? Uh, Again, I can't see the US at the moment pushing for countries to be neutral to the extent that they would have less influence. On the other hand, they do want to have they won't have the influence, but want to yeah put the troops in other places. So, what can actually happen here, though?
I have said from the beginning that NATO would not survive this war. Whenever this war ends, I think NATO will end. We are clearly in a very fragile economic position. We want to leave. We should have left Europe largely by the mid 1990s. And at the time, there were people in the Senate as well as in European capitals who were desperately searching for a reason to justify NATO and keep us tied down in Europe. They found it, they thought, in the Balkans. And we've been struggling with these kinds of stupid misadventures ever since. Remember, hubris and miscalculation also play a big role in all of this. Everybody miscalculated about Russia. Everybody miscalculated about ourselves. But the hubris remains. Nobody wants to admit anything has changed in the world. It's as simple as that. We're still see ourselves as the center of the universe. That's absurd. That's where we are. And there is nothing to stop Russia, unless you wanted to use a nuclear weapon, from settling the war on its own terms. And no one wants to risk the use of a nuclear weapon. Certainly nobody sane in Washington, and there's nobody I know in Moscow that wants to do that. So I think NATO will just collapse. Henry James said sacred cows are never slain, they simply vanish. I think that's what will happen with NATO. We'll wake up and it's effectively gone. I don't think the EU is going to make it either. And remember, and you're a European, the way the world looks from Oslo is very different from the way the world looks from Rome or Madrid or Athens. And trying to hold this conglomerate to get together is just an unrealistic expectation. It's unnatural. It's exclusively a product of the Cold War.
Well, on the topic of countries seeing the world in a different way, and also in the context of this of the 9th of May celebrations, I see that the defeat of fascism is used in different ways. I mean, in Europe, of course, we present Putin as the new Hitler constantly, but in Russia as well, they evidently link the current war, the proxy war with NATO, to this. To the Second World War as well, in terms of fighting fascism, and of course, these huge Western forces, as it wasn't just Germany who invaded the Soviet Union. But more recently now as well, we saw the Chinese making a comment. Xi Jinping made a comment which appeared in Financial Times, where he compared the United States actions in the international system as well. He compared it to Hitler's armies. How do you see? Isn't this a very huge escalation in rhetoric, or do you see a possible like military alliance between the Chinese or Russians, or are they too averse to this, or well, what do you think these comments are attempting to achieve or legitimize, or is it just a lot of bluster and demonization?
Well, the Nazi nostalgia in Ukraine is real. The history of Ukraine is very complex. Millions of Ukrainians were murdered between 1929 and 1932 under Stalin, under communism. And the NKVD officers who carried it out went to the prisons to recruit people to help them do it. The Ukrainians have not forgotten that. And that was arguably a larger loss of life than we saw in the Holocaust with the Jews. Uh, these areas have long histories, long memories. So the Russians look at this, they see Nazi nostalgia and Nazi symbols, and they're horrified. For many of the Ukrainians, and let's be frank, for most of the people in Eastern Europe on any given day, if they had a choice between Nazism and communism, they did not choose communism. But that's not part of the narrative in the East. It's not the narrative in the West. It's really quite interesting. Uh, that's another subject. But the bottom line is that if you're trying to legitimate yourself, it's an easy target to say, well, they're Nazi-like. The truth is, if we're like anybody, we're like the British Empire. And if you're Chinese, you're worried about the South China Sea because one of the things that put China in a very difficult position strategically was the Royal Navy that ran amok in the South China Sea and made it impossible for the Chinese to win the Opium Wars. Remember, the British went right in, sailed up the rivers, pounded the forts, and compelled the Chinese to allow the importation of opium and the exportation of opium. A terrible impact on the population and the people that lived there. The Chinese view Christianity differently. They had a man in the 1840s, 30s, and 40s who declared himself the reincarnation of Jesus Christ and led a civil war that took over 20 years to finally stop and killed millions and millions of Chinese. So the Chinese have a very different view of Christianity from what we understand. We don't bother to learn anything about this. And I simply think that Taiwan was the unsinkable aircraft carrier during World War II for the Imperial Japanese. China will not allow any foreign power to dominate Taiwan and use it again against China. It's that simple. We need to understand that and stop talking about Taiwan. I think all of these allusions to the past are done for reasons that have domestic roots in Russia and China and elsewhere, just as we use them. I would say that I wouldn't pay too much attention to them, but I would look at the results. And right now, I think Russia and China together, along with the growing BRICS collection, are people that have said, we've had enough of you, the United States, and your partners in the West. And the interesting thing to me is that, most of it, if you don't like us, the other people they don't like are the British and the French, probably to some extent the Belgians and maybe the Dutch. These are the colonial powers. The Germans came into that very, very late, and there was never much enthusiasm for it in Germany. The rest of Europe was not involved in that sort of thing. So you can't blanket say one way or the other. But as far as we're concerned, we are very much meddling everywhere in the world the way the British did. They meddled. They meddled on the continent. They meddled in Africa. They meddled in Asia. They meddled in India. That's not a good thing from the standpoint of all of the people that live in these areas. And it's in our best interest not to meddle. But we have built a system. We have built structures in this country to support and sustain meddling, to project meddling, to tinker with other people's societies. We all hoped that President Trump would take it on. Well, we were happy when the National Endowment for Education, or no, National Endowment for Democracy, and then oh gosh, my brain's not working clearly. The various world agencies, help me out. I can't remember the damn acronym for it. But Elon Musk went into these things and discovered massive fraud. Thank God for Elon Musk because that massive fraud was real. And the National Endowment for Democracy was another CIA front trying to destabilize other people's countries in the name of democracy. All this sort of thing needs to stop. And I think Donald Trump took some very good steps in that direction. But he's still dealing with the intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA. And the CIA is still a rogue organization. And I think he has to understand that. again, President Trump has good intentions, but President Trump needs to focus here at home, not overseas. He needs to dismantle the meddling networks, the imperial structures. Those need to go away. But he really needs to focus here and understand what he's dealing with inside his own government. I think he has some understanding of it, but not as much as he needs. And he really needs to focus on it. But again, he's surrounded by people who are telling him different things. And he is unfortunately too easily influenced by too many of the wrong people.
Yeah. Just a very quick answer as we're running out of time. How do you see now the possibility of actually reaching a peace to end this end the proxy war in Ukraine? Do you think it's too late? It will be resolved on the battlefield, or because I saw
I
JD
think
Vance saying the Russians ask for too much.
uh,
So, but again, just pragmatically, it's the Russians that are holding the cards. If the Americans want to pressure someone, it would be easier to pressure the Europeans and the Ukrainians. But yeah, did you see any path to peace, or is it just going to end on
well,
the
there's a
battlefield?
path to peace, but it's not going to be through Washington. And J.D. Vance doesn't understand the region and its history. So I don't know why he said that. The Russians have never asked for very much, but the more time has passed, the more blood that's being spilled, the more reason for the Russians to demand more territory as a means of protecting themselves. Uh, these conversations that happen in the United States are just uninformed. There's no real deep understanding of any of it. That's the problem. I don't know how you fix that. We do not have a core of professional diplomats that have spent their lives learning other languages, living in other countries, and understand all of these dynamics. What we do is we've bred a core of meddlers who think it's their God-given right to crusade for some notion of democracy, which is utter nonsense, and that has caused enormous trouble. You would have thought that the 10-year disaster in Vietnam would have sobered us up, but apparently it didn't. It's a self-perpetuating industry in this town or in Washington, D.C. So I think it will end, but it'll end on Russia's terms. We won't have much to do with it. But the Russians, again, Mr. Putin is not a stupid man. He knows that he inevitably, in order to have a solution that will work, will need others that border Russia to participate. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova. At some point, they will have to be brought in and sign on for whatever solution is reached. And I think he understands that. The bigger issue for us right now is clearly what's going on in the Middle East. And I think President Trump wants to avoid a war with Iran, no doubt in my mind. But can he? Because Mr. Netanyahu is desperately interested in a war because he sees this as the right time and the right opportunity because he has control of the House and the Senate in the United States, and he controls much of national policy. The fact that Donald Trump and he don't like each other doesn't really matter very much. Uh, Nobody likes Netanyahu. He's an arrogant sociopath. But the billionaires that constitute the backbone of AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, they have enormous power over the White House and President Trump. So let us say, what I worry about more than anything else is not that we will start a war with Iran, but perhaps Mr. Netanyahu marches quickly into Gaza to butcher the remainder of the population, and President Sisi in Egypt says we can't tolerate that and sends in the Egyptian army. He will probably be supported by the Jordanians. And then we will see this war spread. Iran has said it will stand by Egypt. What do the Saudis and the Emirates do? They're not going to sign on for the mass murder of the people in Gaza. So the real question at that point is, what do the Turks do? Erdogan has tried to play both sides to the middle. But when this commences against Egypt, If it happens, as I think it will, and the Israelis then go to war with Egypt, it will be impossible, I think, for the Turks to sit it out. I think that's when you get your regional war. Now, the other possibility is Mr. Netanyahu decides to simply attack Iran, period. Boom. That will start a regional war. But Mr. Netanyahu is fairly confident, and probably is right to be confident, that whatever he does, we will back him.